It's an honor to be talking to you today about the climate, nature, and justice crisis. Julie's Bicycle is a not-for-profit that unites culture, creativity, and climate action to drive change. We were founded almost 20 years ago, and we're one of the first organizations to recognize the cultural sector's potential to lead climate action. And through continuous innovation, advocacy, and collaboration, we've remained at the forefront of the creative climate movement. Our team combines both cultural and environmental sector expertise and knowledge to build experience in the creative climate movement. JB has partnered with thousands of organizations, networks, and artists, and the work generates insights and ideas relevant to both climate and cultural policy. At this critical moment in human evolution, the creative and cultural community have an urgent and unique responsibility to remember and honor our connection with one another and nature. I'll be talking us through what climate justice is, what effect it's had, what effect colonialism has had on the environment, how many of our connections to land and nature practices have been disrupted as a consequence. I'll talk us through ecocide and militarism, from greenhouse gas emissions to how this is intimately intertwined with the climate crisis. I'll talk about ecocide, the latest evidence, and I'll also talk about the impacts of green colonialism and eco-normalization. And I'll finally close with examples of ecosumud, which I'll define, and culture-based practices, and how they can lead to transformative, regenerative futures. And if we have time at the end, we'll decompress together. The effects of climate change are unevenly felt on local, national, and global levels. Those who have contributed the least to causing this crisis are often the most exposed to its impacts. Movements for climate and environmental justice and frameworks like Just Transition help us to understand and consider approaches to address the planetary crisis in ways which moves us towards just and inclusive futures. According to Friends of the Earth, climate justice recognizes the climate crisis as a social and political problem, as well as an environmental one. It acknowledges that different communities feel the effects of the climate crisis differently, and that the responsibility for the crisis rests with some countries and companies more than others. Climate justice is about recognizing the interconnectedness of struggles, and in doing so, fighting for solutions to the climate crisis that not only reduce emissions, but create a fairer and more just world in the process. And many believe that actually climate justice is racial justice. You can see here a list of, in addition to racial justice, the frameworks that are often used to address climate justice and that are inherently form part of climate and environmental justice. These are struggles that intersect across the struggles for equity. For example, labor justice, justice for indigenous people, health justice, economic justice, land justice, intergenerational justice, and so much more. For example, low-income communities, disabled people, and people of the global majority are more likely to live near sources of pollution from industrial activities, waste disposal sites, and contaminated water sources. And this has a significant impact on the health of those communities. Here in the UK, where I'm currently based, Black people are more at risk of respiratory illnesses from exposure to air pollution than other groups, leading to increased lung disease and reduced life expectancy. The IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN body tasked with bringing together all of the latest data to shape climate policy decisions, recognized in its 6th report that colonialism, not just as a historical event, but also its ongoing legacy, is a key driver of climate vulnerability. And this was a real first. So it means that regions of the world who were historically colonized are now more vulnerable to climate hazards and with the fewest means to adapt or recover because these systems shifted how their economies function, how much they can develop, and where their populations live. And here you can see a map of countries that were either colonized by Europeans or influenced by colonization. The Industrial Revolution and the wealth of the global north was built on the extraction and trade of resources like rare earth minerals and fossil fuels through colonialism. It also changed our relationship with nature from something that we're part of to a resource to be used and discarded through intensive industrialized processes. And unfortunately, colonial structures still have legacies. Carbon Brief analyzed the historical emissions of countries that were colonized and where resources were extracted from. Reallocating this emissions data to the colonial power dramatically increases their historical emissions and reaffirms the disproportionate historical responsibility of the global north for the crisis we are in today. Now, with the IPCC report, the world's top scientists are acknowledging that decolonization has to be at the heart of the global response to climate change. One of the most brutal cases of ongoing colonialism is in Palestine. And in Gaza, there is a genocide, an ecocide, a culturicide, a many sides. And so for the remainder of our time together, I'll focus on Palestine because, as Angela Davis says, Palestine is the litmus test of our time. I quote the below findings from a very recently released paper called Evaluating War-Induced Damage to Agricultural Land in the Gaza Strip since October 2023. It's written by He Yin, Lina Eklund, Dima Habash, Mazen Qumsiye, and Jamin van den Hoek. They found that between 64 to 70% of tree crop fields in Gaza were damaged between October 2023 and September 2024, so in less than a year. And Gaza City experienced the highest degree of damage, with over 90% of tree crop fields lost. The study also found that 58% of all greenhouses in the Gaza Strip had been damaged by September 2024. So since then, there's surely to have been much more damage. This significantly affects food production in the region and has exacerbated famine, in addition to, of course, the total blockade. The damage to tree crops has serious implications for food security, which of course is obvious, and sustainable food production, as olives and citruses are evergreen trees that take 5 to 7 years to start becoming productive, and then up to 15 years to actually reach maturity. And this longer time for recovery of these tree species has a larger impact on ensuring the delivery of sustainable food systems when compared to the recovery of other damaged crops, such as seasonal vegetables or grain crops. The majority of trees grown in Gaza are olive trees, and olive oil is traditionally and historically used as a high-value stored food for subsequent years and periods of poor harvest or economic and political instability. When it comes to climate and militarism, we see that by the end of October 2023, Israel had granted 12 licenses for oil exploration off the Gaza coast. Emissions from the first 120 days of the genocide in Gaza exceed the annual emissions of 26 countries and territories. The war itself is estimated to have generated the carbon equivalent of burning more than 1.5 million barrels of oil. And when you include post-war or genocide reconstruction estimates, it's equivalent to New Zealand's annual footprint and is higher than the annual emissions of 135 individual nations. The US military is the single largest institutional fossil fuel user in the world. Weapons, of course, also impact agriculture, soil, water, and air quality and destroy natural habitats. In 2023 alone, countries spent $2,443 billion on their militaries, but repeatedly failed to meet their climate spending commitments. So what's the connection between militarism and the climate crisis? The Transnational Institute's research shows that 4 of the 5 world's biggest polluters are also amongst the 5 biggest military spenders. Just 5% of global military spending would pay for the missed global climate finance target at COP28. The richest countries also export arms to the 40 most climate vulnerable countries. Not only are they failing to provide long-promised money to cope with the impacts of climate change, they're also exporting weapons, fueling conflicts and increasing vulnerability. And these same wealthy countries also spend more on arming their borders to keep migrants out than on tackling the crisis that forces people from their homes in the first place. While climate change is an absolute nightmare for most of us, it's big business for both the big arms firms as well as the gigantic asset managers that finance both the oil and the arms industry. They're all profiting from the destruction of our livelihoods. In addition to militarism through the use of white phosphorus, bombs, fires, this isn't the only form of ecocide that's inflicted on Palestine. On August 23rd, 2025 alone, in one day, the Israeli military uprooted nearly 3,000 olive trees in the village of Al Mughayr near Ramallah, as reported in Al Jazeera. Soldiers stormed the village at dawn, raided more than 30 homes, destroyed vehicles, and imposed a lockdown. The official claim was that the trees posed a security threat to a nearby settlement road. Israeli officials offered no explanation of how centuries-old olive trees could threaten anyone. And now I'll read an extract directly from Joanne Zreg's article because she makes the connection between nature's rights and settler colonialism so fluidly. These trees represent more than agriculture. They provide evidence of Palestinian presence spanning centuries. Their deep root systems and longevity create a living testimony to indigenous Palestinian care of the land. Each destroyed tree erases evidence of Palestinian cultivation, and with it, the very proof of Palestinian existence. Israeli authorities understand that removing this evidence helps legitimize settlement expansion and land seizure. The tree's destruction makes Palestinian claims to the land harder to document and defend. The olive tree is inseparable from the land itself. Each tree carries centuries of labor of the ancestors whose presence is encoded in its roots. Planted forests of pines, cypresses, and other non-native trees, aiming to Europeanize the landscape and assert control over the land, has been a tactic of the Zionist entity since the early 1900s. The rationale was to transform the environment to reflect a European aesthetic, reinforcing the settler colonial narrative. These trees, which are invasive species essentially, became highly flammable due to the resinous needles and dense growth, contributing to devastating wildfires, such as the 2021 Jerusalem wildfires, which destroyed over 4,942 acres of forested land. Moreover, the acidic soil conditions created by these plantations inhibit the growth of native vegetation, further disrupting the indigenous ecosystem. Unlike these non-native species, olive trees are well adapted to the region, resilient to drought and fire, and perfectly attuned to the land. While settlers attempt to impose foreign trees and reshape the landscape, nature itself resists the colonial claim. There are many cases of indigenous land defenders worldwide, of course, and in Palestine over the past 100 years. This is one of them recently murdered in the West Bank by an Israeli settler, Auda Hathalin. He's part of a beautiful community in the West Bank who have spent decades resisting and fighting to stay on their native land. On eco-normalization and green colonialism. So eco-normalization with Israel, which Israel has worked very hard on as one of its key international agendas, creates water stress across the rest of the countries that make up Blad el-Sham. So this is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and of course, occupied Palestine itself. Project Prosperity is a project that was established at COP27 in Egypt, and it was brokered by the UAE and then signed by Jordan and Israel, is a normalization agreement divided into two projects, Project Blue and Project Green. Palestine is technically a party to this agreement, but has no role in it. So the agreement was that Jordan will buy 200 million cubic meters of water annually from an Israeli desalination plant on the Mediterranean coast, powered by a solar energy plant in Jordan, which was built by a UAE-owned renewable energy company called Masdar. Jordan also has to then sell all of the renewable energy generated from this plant to Israel. Jordan is then also locked into another agreement to import natural gas from Israel. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, Israel has been usurping water from Jordan's share of the Jordan and Yarmouk rivers. Israeli policies have deteriorated the quality of water in the Sea of Galilee and disrupted the flow of the Jordan River. Mekorot, the Israeli water company, directly diverts supplies of water from the West Bank and Jordan to serve settlements along the Nakab. Researcher Yasmin Hafiz writes, today, however, the Jordan River, and especially its lower branch, linking Lake Tabarias to the Dead Sea, is a shadow of its former self. Over the last 50 years, the river's annual flow has dropped to less than 10% of its historical average. The Dead Sea is shrinking at a rate of about a meter per year. So water scarcity will also be a financial burden, with estimates suggesting that the Arab region will suffer the most of any region around the world, costing governments 7 to 14% of their gross domestic product by 2050. What do reparations look like? According to the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy, to date, the total estimated amount of the military and conflict-related climate reparations owed by Israel and its allies to the Palestinian people since the Nakba, the catastrophe in 1948, is 148 billion US dollars. So Israel is responsible for 103 billion of this, the US is responsible for 40.8 billion, and then the other allies like Germany, France, the UK, Italy, etc. make up the rest. Reparations could look like recognition of ecocide, like genocide, in the International Criminal Court. Accountability, so integrating military-linked climate harms into war crime tribunals. Upholding, so acknowledging the Palestinian resource sovereignty and rights over natural resources, and mechanisms for victims of ecocide to access climate finance are essential. And then, of course, the reparations of the total 148 billion US dollars that is owed to the Palestinian people. I'll now move on to talk about ecosumud, which is a term coined by Manal Sher. Sumud, which means steadfastness in Arabic, is the steadfastness that Palestinians have upheld in the face of Israeli oppression. It refers to the people's persistence in staying on their land and maintaining their Palestinian identity and culture. Ecosumud, Manal Shuker says, combines Palestinians' everyday practices of steadfastness with environmentally friendly ways of maintaining a strong attachment to the land, covering the indigenous land-based knowledge, cultural values, tactics, and tools Palestinians employ to fight back against the violent Israeli settler colonial disruption of their sustainable relationship with the land. The Arab Group for the Protection of Nature have a project called Revive Gaza's Farmland. It aims to rehabilitate Gaza's agricultural sector and restore local food systems to combat the widespread famine and counter the blockade and eventually, of course, build food sovereignty. They also have a Million Tree campaign, which they launched in 2001 to replant trees across the entire of Palestine under the slogan, "They uproot a tree, we replant 10." The significance of the program lies in counteracting Israel's deliberate confiscation of agricultural lands, which have contributed to high rates of food insecurity and unemployment in Palestine. A project that's very dear to my heart is Dar Jasser in Bethlehem. Dar Jasser for Art and Research is a grassroots independent artist-run initiative rooted in a 19th century family home. It's a multifaceted project that's devoted to educational, cultural, and agricultural activities. It's an experimental learning hub for the community and beyond, a place to ask questions, exchange ideas, to dream, and to grapple with the contemporary situation. Muhammad Saleh planted the seed of the first urban farm in Palestine, and he leads workshops. Him and his colleagues, of course, lead workshops for community members, teaching children how to grow their own food. He sees this work as healing the soil itself. Of course, there are remnants of tear gas canisters, bullets, and so on. And so this initiative is directly targeting this, really looking at how a cultural institution can also make space for farmland, how it's possible to grow farms anywhere, even in urban environments. Citizen farming as art and resistance, one of the a refugee that became quite famous on the internet, on TikTok and other social media platforms is Mido Halimi. And I'll show you a video of his.
Genocide is over. A lot of you ask me why. They do something of planting every day until this genocide is over. A lot of you ask me why I plant. Planting for me is a form of resistance. I bring life to earth. They're taking away life, but I'm bringing it to earth. And I hope that my plants have strong roots to the ground, just like we Palestinians do. Today I'm not planting. I have to fix the farm, expand it a little bit, and I'm going to show you guys how my farm looks like, since a lot of you have been asking. Let's check out my melons. They have flowers now. Look at that. This is my watermelon. Lucia over there. Lima beans. Looking pretty good. And menta right now. It's not mentita anymore. Splendid.
Mido Halimi, alongside thousands of other agriculturalists, artists, citizens of Gaza, was killed during this genocide. I'll now move on to Foragers by filmmaker and artist Jumana Manna. It's a film that is part documentary and part archival footage and part fiction, well acted as well. It traces the struggle of foragers across Palestine, particularly in the West Bank, where new Israeli laws have come in over the past decades to try and stop Palestinians from foraging their native plants, particularly Ya'ub and Za'atar. I'll show you a trailer of this film.
More caffeine, arriving today with Amazon Prime. That's off your mind.
بس صور خلانك إياه سن يرحم أهله. أعطوه ذا أخت السلام أختم هي زي من بلادي بعيد يا حرام.
אתם עומדים לי על מה שנכנס לי למעיים, אני והילדים שלי, ואת אומרת לקראתי. איפה לקראתי?
יש חוק במדינה. אתה נמצא פה בבית משפט.
אבל זה חרא של חוק. לאסור מאיתנו ללכת ליערות, לאסוף אוכל.
לא, אני רואה שאין מה לדבר איתך.
צמח מוגן. איזה צמח מוגן? האדמה לא שלכם. גם הצמח הוא לא שלכם, מה שצומח באדמה. איזה צמח מוגן, איזה בטיח.
So these are under the guise of environmental laws that Israel has implemented on the native people of Palestine, when really it's to make their lives harder, is to continue developing their apartheid system, rather than caring for the land. Because of course, if they truly cared for the land and for the, any so-called effects that over foraging might take, then they wouldn't be uprooting thousands and upon thousands of olive trees, and of course using illegal weapons and bombs like white phosphorus across Palestine and South Lebanon. So what can we do from our position, from our cultural sector, and within our cultural sector? We can commission, create, and support justice-focused work. We can look at ethical funding and divesting from unethical funding and any sponsorship that is complicit in climate catastrophe and genocide. Culture Unstained is a campaigning organization highlighting complicit sponsorship from banks and fossil fuel companies like British Petroleum, BP. Also, for example, RBC, the Royal Bank of Canada, has invested over 9 billion shares and loans in weapon manufacturers supplying Israel from 2022 to 2024 alone. So it's increasing its investment substantially and profiting from the genocide. RBC was also a principal economic agent in the violent expansion of settler colonialism in the west of so-called Canada in the late 1800s, contributing to the genocide of First Nations people. Still, they're involved now in illegally evicting indigenous peoples to build gas pipes, and we can see how connected these two struggles are. We can also look at our procurement and our supply chains, what materials we choose to buy and where they come from, and of course, looking at the technology that we use, at the companies we choose to invest our subscriptions in, whether they are also complicit in genocide. And these are time-consuming processes. However, there is fast advancement as ethical alternatives are emerging. You can look at the partnerships and collaborations that you have. How is it that you can support those across internationally that are suffering as a consequence of environmental and climate injustice, and how can you support them in ecosumud, for example, that these are projects that are rooted in connection to land and resistance, and inevitably through that life emerges, joy emerges, pride emerges. You can look at your policies and governance, and putting in place ethical fundraising for policies, for example, and anti-racist and equitable policies. And of course, you can join the movement in any way that you can in advocating and speaking up for these injustices. Thank you very much. These are some of the sources, the sources that I've used throughout this talk. I appreciate you listening to me. I appreciate that some of you may already know a lot of this information, and for others it's new. And regardless where we are on this journey of understanding, of researching, of building our knowledge, that this is not easy material. You can probably tell by all the times that I stuttered and mispronounced words, because they're very hard for them. It's very hard for them to come out of my mouth, out of my body. And so if this affects you as much as it affects me, and of course, it also fuels us in this path to liberation for all indigenous peoples of this earth, and for a respect and love for nature that we see, like indigenous people do, that we see ourselves as one with nature.